Hello and welcome back to another update as I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the north in the direction of Pishane, where the Russians have started launching offensive operations northwest of Berestova in the direction of Pishane. The geographical position of Pishane is located in a rift where the southern and northern parts that is under Ukrainian control is in the high grounds where the Ukrainian fortified positions are located both to the north and to the south of the village. With that, we see that my prediction from the 29th of January, which is almost 5 months ago, about the Russian advance north of Berestove. Now we also see further advancements here to the south, both to the north of Berestove and to the east of Pishane. This is an interesting advance as it leads to either side of these two villages. Following that, many months later, the Russians attacked the village of Berestove and managed to capture it. Since then, they have been fighting over the western parts of Rozdolivka to secure that area and gain control over the area north of the Serbets river line. If the Russians capture the village of Berestove, then they will have secured the Rozdolivka village as well as creating and making themselves a springboard for further offensive operations in the direction of Pishane. And now we see the follow-up from Berestove towards Pishane. The main reason why the Russians are attacking from the eastern direction is due to the geographic position of Pishane. Taking a look at the topographic map, we see Berestove down here to the south, where it is located on the low ground, and Pishane here in the center, Hreorivka to the north. All of the villages are located on the low ground, while the surrounding areas are located in the heights. The Ukrainian fortified positions north and south of Pishane are both located in the heights, and now with the Russian capture of Berestove, they now have a foothold within the heights to the south of Pishane, and they are advancing through those heights towards the fortified positions from the south. Following that, they will likely push through from the west of Hreorivka towards the forest lines and the heights west of the village, before moving on to flank the Ukrainian fortified positions north of the village. As we see with the fortified positions, Russians are fighting along the high ground towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians south of Pishane, and after that they'll likely push through from the west of Hreorivka along the road to flank the Ukrainian fortified positions north of Pishane. And that is the significance of such a small advance. It is the marking of a new offensive operations by the Russians in this section of the front line following the capture of Berestove. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here in the direction of Terny and Rozdolivka, positional fighting continues. The Russians have managed to push the Ukrainians back to Terny in the north, recapturing lost positions that the Ukrainians managed to recapture in the past month, and push the Ukrainians back to the village itself. Further southeast of Rozdolivka, the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians further back from the forest patches east of Rozdolivka, where they've managed to recapture another forest line, and with this the Russians have been pushed further back in the direction of Rozdolivka. So there's positional fighting as the Russians are pushing in the north and being pushed back in the south. Such a back and forth situation does not happen much across the front. It is currently happening in the north by Lipsy and Vovchansk, and now by Kreminna along the Serbets River between Kreminna and Liman. North of Soledar, the Russians have pushed yet again in the northeast of Rozdolivka, capturing a series of Ukrainian fortified positions north of the village. Reaching the northern parts of Rozdolivka, it seems that the Ukrainians' defenses north of Rozdolivka have collapsed following the recent Russian assaults northeast and in the village itself. With this, we see that the Russians have made significant progress in the fortifications north of the village and have pushed to gain a foothold within the village, and this points towards the village of Rozdolivka falling into Russian hands very soon, which would pave the way for Russian offensive operations in the direction of Hreorivka, Pishane, the direction of Vyemka to the northeast, and Vasyukivka to the west. All of these frontline villages could become the next target for the Russian offensive operations north of Soledar in the direction of the Siversk front. In the direction of Chasiv Yar, the Russians have managed to cross the Canal line here in the southern flank of the Chasiv Yar micro-district and Chasiv Yar itself. With this, the Russians have managed to capture the fortified positions of the Ukrainians along the canal crossing here with the forest patch, and with this, the Russians have improved their positions along the canal line. This crossing allows the Russians to conduct positional fighting all across the forest patch here south of Chasiv Yar, which will allow them to conduct in-depth reconnaissance on Ukrainian positions within the city of Chasiv Yar, both in the central, eastern, and southern parts of the city. If the Russians manage to push in a northern direction towards the western part of the canal here across the Canal micro-district, it could flank the Ukrainian fortified positions, completely negating the strength and power of it being built over the past few months, allowing the Ukrainians to hold the canal line will now be negated with the Russian crossing here to the south if the Russians are able to push enough strength across and into the western bank of the canal line to be able to expand their foothold and flank the Ukrainian positions in the area. Although the developments across the front line are slow, a lot of fighting is taking place near the front and heavy bombardment takes place in the city of Chasiv Yar. Further south here in the direction of Hreorivka, the Russians managed to capture the rest of the town completely, as is seen with this geolocated footage here. The Russians were reportedly also able to enter Maksymilianivka, however it was then reported that the Ukrainians launched a counterattack, regaining some of their positions and pushing the Russians out of Maksymilianivka. However, we see that the proximity between Hreorivka and Maksymilianivka are so close, meaning that the Russians will likely be able to re-enter at any point and will now focus on consolidating their gains by pushing in a northern direction in between Krasnohorivka and Hreorivka, which will strengthen the Russian positions in the southern parts of Krasnohorivka and hit the Ukrainian supply lines along the railways between Krasnohorivka and Hostre. The fighting taking place here by Maksymilianivka is closely related to the fighting by Krasnohorivka. We see that the main axis of attack by the Russians towards Krasnohorivka is from the south and southeast. At the same time, there was a secondary push from the northeast. This means that the Russians' main push is coming from the south, where they have control over the southern parts of Krasnohorivka. However, they are unable to fully push in the northern direction because at the same time they have to defend against the western flank, where the Ukrainians can constantly launch counterattacks towards the weaker flank of the Russian forces within Krasnohorivka. Although there is open fields, there is also weakly fortified positions here to the west compared to the east with heavy fortifications. This means that the Ukrainians are able to put and allow heavy pressure on the western flank of Krasnohorivka under the Russian control. Therefore, with a push towards Maksymilianivka, this limits the ability of the Ukrainians to conduct counterattacks, and if the Russians manage to consolidate their gains here to the north of Hreorivka, they'll be able to secure the lakes here to the south of Krasnohorivka and push in a western direction to secure their western flank, allowing them to concentrate their forces in a northern direction through Krasnohorivka. Therefore, we see that heavy pressure will likely be exerted onto Maksymilianivka to redirect Ukrainian forces and to pressure the Ukrainian supply lines in the area. Finally, further south in the direction of Pereskovivka, northwest of Novomikhailivka, the Russians have advanced northeast of the village and west of the village, strengthening their positions around the village and pushing onwards towards Kostyantynivka. This is in relation to the recent progress by the Russians in the area, where they're looking to connect between Novomikhailivka in the south and Pobieda in the north. Pushing down along the roads will allow the Russians to connect north of Pereskovivka, aligning the front line along the road here between Pobieda and Kostyantynivka, after which they'll likely launch operations from Pobieda in a southern direction towards the Ukrainian fortified positions in the area. At the same time, the Russians will also likely push south of Hreorivka towards the road, main highway between Marinka and Kurahove, and towards Pobieda. This will allow the Russians to attack both flanks of the Ukrainian fortified positions in the area. Capturing that will allow the Russians to push onwards to the Ukrainian fortified positions north of Kostyantynivka. So we're seeing that the push through Hreorivka, capturing the final parts of the town and pushing towards Maksymilianivka, improves the Russian positions both in the direction of Krasnohorivka and Pobieda, in extension in the direction of Kostyantynivka. So we see heavy fighting takes place across the front, with significant developments taking place as the Russians continue their offensive operations across the month of June, of which the first half is now over. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.